It started with a silent, unthinkable scene. A tiny baby, just 6 months old, was found alone in her crib. The back door stood wide open, letting in the cool Texas air. Inside the bedroom, chaos. The mattress shifted, the headboard cracked, papers scattered everywhere. But the young mother who should have been there was gone. Her name was Rochelle O'Neal Tollison, and what happened to her would haunt her small town for decades. A predator she once knew had slipped into her home in the dead of night. By the time anyone realized she was missing, the clock had already started ticking toward a fate so horrific it would shock even seasoned investigators. And more than 21 years later, that same predator, Moises Mendoza, would face the ultimate punishment on death row. But before that, he'd leave behind a final statement that would stun many who heard it. You're watching Death Row Diaries. March 18, 2004, Farmersville, Texas. A quiet, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other and news traveled fast. Rochelle O'Neal Tollison was just 20 years old. She lived in a modest home with her baby daughter Avery, who was only 6 months old. Rochelle was going through a difficult divorce, but despite the challenges, friends and family described her as loving, responsible, and devoted to her child. That morning, her mother arrived at the house to check on her. The moment she stepped inside, she knew something was wrong. The back door was wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze, an unusual sight for someone as cautious as Rochelle. The stillness inside felt unnatural. Then came the discovery that froze her blood. Little Avery, lying alone in her crib, crying. Rochelle was nowhere to be seen. Walking through the bedroom, her mother's fears deepened. The mattress and box spring were pushed out of alignment. The headboard was damaged, like someone had shoved it with force. Furniture sat in odd places. Papers, clothing, and personal belongings were scattered as if there had been a struggle. The scene was disturbing, and it told a silent story. Something violent had happened here. Rochelle's mother immediately called the police, triggering an investigation that would grip the town. As detectives began piecing together Rochelle's last known movements, one name surfaced quickly: Moises Mendoza. Mendoza wasn't a stranger. In fact, he and Rochelle had known each other for years. They attended the same high school in northern Texas. On the surface, there was nothing extraordinary about him. He'd been described by some as hard-working in his early life, but others remembered moments of aggression and disturbing behavior, including one incident in which he violently pinned down his own mother and sister in their front yard. In the days before the disappearance, Mendoza had been to Rochelle's house for a small gathering, about 15 people, nothing unusual for someone her age. But behind the casual reunion was something far darker brewing. On the night she vanished, Mendoza entered Rochelle's home through an unlocked back door. The prosecution later argued that he abducted her straight from her house, leaving her baby behind.
Mendoza's own account, however, was different. He told investigators they had left together briefly to get cigarettes. But no matter which version you believe, what happened next took a vicious turn. While driving, Mendoza suddenly lashed out, choking Rochelle until she lost consciousness. He then took her to a secluded area near his home, far away from where anyone could hear her screams. What happened in that secluded spot would forever mark Mendoza as one of the most sadistic killers Cullen County had ever seen. When Rochelle regained consciousness, she found herself in a terrifying situation, completely at his mercy. Mendoza sexually assaulted her, then strangled her until her body went limp. But that wasn't enough. He took a knife and stabbed her in the throat. The brutality of the act suggested deep rage and a complete disregard for human life. This was no impulsive loss of control. It was deliberate, calculated cruelty. With the attack complete, Mendoza was left with a body he needed to hide. But instead of acting quickly, he did something chilling. He left her in the field for days. Days later, Mendoza returned to the field where Rochelle's body lay. By then, decomposition had set in, but he wasn't concerned with dignity or respect. He was focused solely on eliminating evidence. He wrapped her body in a tarp, transported it to his cousin's property in Farmersville, Texas, and carried out one of the most disturbing acts in the case. He set her remains on fire. The fire burned away much of the physical evidence, but not enough to erase the crime entirely. Once the body had been reduced to charred remains, he dumped what was left in a creek bed. But nature has a way of giving victims a voice. On March 23, 2004, 5 days after her disappearance, investigators found the remains. Through dental records, they confirmed the worst. It was Rochelle. The community's grief was matched only by outrage, and it wouldn't take long for the investigation to point directly to Mendoza. If you've been following this case so far, make sure you subscribe to Row Diaries, turn on notifications, and stay tuned. March 23, 2004. As word spread that Rochelle's remains had been found, investigators already had their eyes on one suspect, Moises Mendoza. The break came faster than anyone expected. The very next day, Mendoza made a chilling mistake. He told a friend that he had killed Rochelle. That friend went straight to the authorities, giving them the confirmation they needed. When police confronted him, they were met with a man who alternated between cold detachment and casual storytelling. Mendoza initially stuck to his cigarette errand version, but evidence quickly tore holes in it. Witness testimony, forensic findings, and his own bragging painted a picture that matched the prosecution's theory. Forced entry, abduction, assault, murder. As detectives dug deeper, more disturbing details emerged about Mendoza's history. This wasn't a one-time explosion of violence. Years earlier, he had physically attacked his mother and sister, not in a private argument, but out in the open, in his own front yard, with enough force to draw attention. And the violence didn't stop there. Prosecutors later revealed that Mendoza had sexually assaulted a 14-year-old girl, another glimpse into a pattern of predatory behavior. Even at the time of Rochelle's disappearance, Mendoza wasn't a free man in the legal sense. He was out on bail for 2 aggravated robberies committed on the Dallas College Richland campus in 2003. This was no random criminal. Mendoza was a man who had been given chance after chance, and each time he had chosen violence.
The trial began in 2005, and it didn't take long for jurors to see the darker side of Mendoza that many in his community had never witnessed. The charge? Capital murder in the course of attempted burglary, kidnapping, and/or aggravated sexual assault. In court, prosecutors laid out the sequence of events with meticulous detail, from the break-in to the final disposal of Rochelle's remains. The brutality wasn't just in the act itself, but in the days that followed, when Mendoza casually returned to the scene to burn her body. Clinical psychologist Mark Vigen testified about Mendoza's mental and emotional makeup. The diagnosis was damning. Emotionally immature, lacking psychological development, and seemingly enjoying deception. Mendoza, Vigen said, reacted with intense anger when faced with criticism, a dangerous mix when paired with his willingness to use violence. Jurors also heard the full scope of his history. His attacks on his mother, his sister, the sexual assault of a minor, all of it painted a portrait of a man driven not by desperation, but by cruelty. Former Collin County 1st Assistant District Attorney Greg Davis didn't mince words when he addressed the court. He called Mendoza one of the most violent, sadistic men he had ever encountered in his career. On June 29, 2005, the jury returned its verdict, guilty of capital murder. The sentence? Death. If you thought the sentencing would mark the end of the story, you'd be wrong. From 2005 onward, Mendoza began a legal marathon, appealing both his conviction and his sentence. The process dragged on for nearly a decade, with ruling after ruling going against him. 2008, Texas Court of Criminal Appeals rejects his first major appeal.
2009, another appeal dismissed. 2012, U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Texas rejects his claims. 2015, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals affirms his sentence. 2019, another denial from the federal courts. 2023, the Fifth Circuit shuts him down again. October 7, 2024, the U.S. Supreme Court rejects his final appeal. The clock was now running out. On December 11, 2024, the state of Texas issued a death warrant, setting his execution for April 23, 2025. The days leading up to his execution were marked by desperation. Mendoza filed last-minute appeals, all of which failed. He even petitioned the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles for clemency, hoping to have his death sentence commuted to life in prison. That, too, was denied. On the morning of April 23, 2025, Mendoza was transported to the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit. He was 41 years old. As the lethal injection process began, Mendoza delivered a final statement. In it, he apologized to Rochelle's daughter, now an adult, and her surviving family. He said, "I'm sorry for robbing you of a mother and loved one," adding that he could never undo what he had done. Then, in Spanish, he addressed his own wife, sister, and 2 friends. "I love you, I am with you, I am well and at peace." It took 19 minutes from the first injection for Mendoza to be pronounced dead. Rochelle's father, Mark O'Neill, did not forgive him. Speaking to the press, O'Neill said he felt sympathy for Mendoza's family, but none for Mendoza himself. He said, "He gave my daughter no mercy when she begged for her life, yet he wanted mercy for his own." Collin County District Attorney Greg Willis called the murder devastating and said the execution was a step toward closure, though the loss could never truly be erased. Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton echoed those sentiments, promising to continue defending the law and holding criminals accountable. When Rochelle was taken, her daughter Avery was just a baby. By the time justice was finally carried out, Avery was a young woman who had lived her entire life without her mother. The case is a stark reminder of how violence ripples outward, touching not just the victim, but entire families and communities. It's also a sobering example of how the justice system moves, sometimes painfully slowly, even in the most clear-cut of cases. From the moment her mother found that back door open to the final words spoken in Huntsville, this case was a 21-year journey of loss, anger, and eventual closure. And while Moises Mendoza is now gone, the memory of Rochelle Tollison, a young mother whose life was cut short in the most brutal way, remains in the hearts of those who loved her. If you found this case as haunting as we did, make sure you subscribe to Death Row Diaries and turn on notifications so you never miss another deep dive into the darkest corners of true crime.